Welcome everyone to Network 2020 and the National Committee on North Korea's webinar on South Korea and the elections. I'm looking forward to a fantastic panel discussion today. My name is Courtney Dogger and I am the president of Network 2020. We're very happy to have this briefing today because in the foreign policy world, we hear a lot about the importance of be able to have a discussion with a step back from the election. So just some background, Network 2020 is an inclusive international community, and we bridge the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy community. We run a number of programs, including these webinars, and so we hope that you will check out our website online, and you can check out past briefings on our YouTube channel as well. It is my great pleasure today to introduce our moderator, Keith Luse. He is the Executive Director of the National Committee on North Korea. He was the Senior East Asia Policy Advisor for Chairman and later Ranking Member Senator Richard Lugar at the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, among many other roles that he has taken. And he made the first of eventually 5 trips to North Korea. He is very highly regarded on the topic of North Korea. And he's been a good partner to Network 2020 and will do an excellent job moderating today's discussion. So welcome, Keith. I will turn it over to you for some words on the National Committee on North Korea and to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Courtney. The National Committee on North Korea is an organization funded by American foundations and organizations which promotes principled engagement between the U.S. and North Korea. It's a real privilege to be able to partner again with Network 2020. NCNK supports U.S. non-governmental organizations which provide humanitarian assistance to the neediest of North Korea's citizens and works to facilitate information sharing among Americans who engage in Track 2 talks or people-to-people talks with North Korea. Today, along with Network 2020, it's our privilege to feature 3 experts on issues pertaining to the Korean Peninsula. We have Jae-myung Lee, Kathy Moon, and Scott Snyder. They will discuss South Korea's upcoming election and its impact on American, South Korean, and North Korean relations. While you've already received their full bios, I'd like to note that Jae-myung Lee is an award-winning writer, commentator, and expert on North Korea, currently serving as co-host of the Lazarus Heist podcast for the BBC World Service and as a senior fellow with the Wilson Center think tank. As a journalist, Lee led the Associated Press news agency's coverage of the Korean Peninsula as bureau chief from 2008 to 2013. Katherine Moon is Professor Emerita at Wellesley College, where she taught in the Department of Political Science and was Wasserman Chair of Asian Studies. She was a senior fellow and inaugural holder of the Korea Studies Chair at Brookings Institution from 2014 to 2016. Scott Snyder is the Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of the Program on U.S. Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His program examines South Korea's efforts to contribute on the international stage, its potential influence and contributions as a middle power in East Asia, and the peninsular, regional, and global implications of North Korean instability. For opening remarks now, I will first turn to Scott and ask Scott, who are the main players in the upcoming election and what are the key issues, including the area of U.S.-South Korea relations, and why is this election so polarizing? Scott, over to you.
Well, thanks, Keith. First, I just want to say that this is a presidential election for a 5-year term. South Korean presidents are term limited. So that means that there is no incumbent running in the election. Also, the South Korean system is one in which the person who wins the most votes wins the election, and there is no runoff. So I think it's important to understand that because it has an impact on election dynamics. The ruling party candidate is Jae-myung. He is the current governor of Gyeonggi province, and he, generally speaking, is aligned with the current administration. If I were to try to describe an analogy for where he stands in the US political context, I would say that the Jae-myung platform is analogous to a kind of Bernie Sanders candidacy. The main opposition candidate is Yoon Seok-youl. He has been running neck and neck with Lee in many of the opinion polls. And he's really a political outsider, a former prosecutor. Because of the scandal related to the Park impeachment, many of the opposition party leaders are new. And if I were to make an analogy for him, I would say he's like if an FBI director were to be recruited to run as an opposition party candidate. The third candidate is An Soo. He is a tech entrepreneur, a third party candidate who's been running about 8 to 10% in the polls. And in some ways, he's like if Ross Perot, a third party candidate, were actively engaged in the election. And then finally, there's Shim Sung-jung. She's a Labor Party candidate running about 2% in the polls. And I would say the analogy there would be if you had a Korean Ralph Nader running in the election. Main issues for the campaign, I would say there are 3 to 4 main issues, and all of them have structural components. One is the issue of youth unemployment. It's related to the inflexibility of the labor system in Korea. So a lot of the focus of the debates has been on that issue. Also, there are issues related to high household debt, and that ties itself in with the real estate market because that is a primary destination for South Korean families to invest. And so issues related to stagnancy and expense in terms of household living expenses are part of this campaign. And then I think there's also the issue of social justice. And this is really about perceptions of fairness and unfairness in South Korean society. And then finally, I would simply say that there's an issue of who do Korean voters trust? The current administration is has been viewed slightly unfavorably by the majority of polls. But when I hear Koreans describing the choices that they have, the phrase that I hear most is lesser of the evils. And so, you know, this is an election in which there's not necessarily a popular candidate. It's really about who is the least unpopular candidate for South Koreans.
Very good. That's a great comprehensive overview. We'll now turn to Jean. Jean, if you could, please describe your view on the election implications for regional dynamics and how South Korea, North Korea, South Korea-China relations may be impacted. Also, I believe that you were recently in South Korea. Feel free to build on any of Scott's remarks, especially if you could touch upon the polarization in the electorate, if you have time. Go ahead, Jean.
Sure, thank you. And thank you to Scott for laying out the main candidates so well. One thing you did not mention, Scott, you left it to me, is to talk about North Korea. That, when we talk about polarization, I would say that is an area where the two main political parties diverge the most. So that means we've seen Blue House policy veer between pro-engagement, progressive presidents. During those presidencies, we saw those inter-Korean summits in 2000, 2007, and 2018. And then, of course, when we have a conservative in the Blue House, a hardline stance toward North Korea. And I would say that among the South Korean people, there is wide disagreement over how to deal with North Korea. And roughly, some of that divergence comes with what generation they're from. You know, you have the generation that survived the Korean War of the 1950s, grew up fiercely opposed to communism. And you've got their children's generation who came of age during this period of pro-democratic, anti-American, pro-North Korean protests in the 1980s. And then you've got their children's generation. They were born into a democratic, first world, globally connected South Korea. And I would say that generation, this younger, the millennials, they're pretty ambivalent toward North Korea, and I would say disconnected from North Korea. And so the importance that North Korea and each candidate's platform on North Korea plays, I think, is really dependent on what generation they're from and their connection to North Korea and how much they perceive that to be a part of their lives. And so, on this issue, I think that youngest generation of voters, which really is kind of the generation of voters, the swing vote that we're not sure, we just don't know how they're going to vote, they are primarily focused on the issues that Scott mentioned, issues that are more domestic, that really pertain to their daily lives and that they think have more impact on their present as well as their future. I would always argue with young South Koreans that North Korea will always be part of their future as well, but they are so disconnected today in some ways from North Korea that it's hard for them to take it into account. In terms of where the two main candidates stand, of course, whether we have a South Korean president who is pushing to engage North Korea versus one who is pushing for sanctions and isolation will affect regional dynamics, and I think will affect the broader regional strategy on how to deal with North Korea. President Moon, of course, and his ruling party will want to see a policy of engagement continue under another Democratic Party president. But if Yoon from the opposition is elected, we should expect to see an about face on engagement. After, he is really all for keeping sanctions in place until we see some denuclearization. He has supported resuming those big joint military drills with the United States that have been suspended and always rile North Korea up. And he has even suggested redeploying tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea. And he's also said he'd consider a preemptive strike on North Korea if we were to see signs of potential imminent attack from the North. And I think I'll leave it at that.
All right, Jean, thank you. Kathy, could you please discuss the demographics and political culture of corruption and familial policies in South Korea, and perhaps delve into issues surrounding the public division on gender issues in this campaign? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's good to be back here. I first met Courtney and the network back in maybe about 6 years ago. So thank you for this reunion. My job right now is to highlight some of the social and political cultural contexts of the election so that it helps our audience understand what are some of these key issues that already have been mentioned by Scott and by Jean, but in a little bit more detail, highlighting particularly young people ages 18 through 39 and women. They are formidable groups, political forces, and they are also issue areas unto themselves. Young people in particular became a very powerful group, especially since 2016. They helped topple conservatives who long held power in South Korea, and they allowed for the Democratic Party, the current ruling party of President Moon Jae-in, to basically reign supreme in the recent years at the central government level, provincial level, and the local level. The Democrats in Korea have had a lock on power in elected office. Young people also fueled the impeachment of former President Park Geun-hye, President Park, for violating state secrets and engaging in bribery and influence schemes. And she helped benefit her personal friend, a very shady character, in the amount of approximately $70 million, as well as enabling access to this woman's daughter to elite universities and high-end equestrian access. Powerful companies like Samsung, LG, so many of the conglomerates were involved in providing funds for these personal gains. And of course, as you know, President Park was impeached significantly through public outcries We all saw the massive candlelight vigils, the peaceful vigils, which were led primarily by very young people in their teens, 20s, and 30s, as well as the elderly family members standing together to try to claim a cleaner, newer Korea. In 2017, the young people propelled President Moon to office. They supported his campaign, his personal pledge to be a, quote, people-centered president. And he was also a self-declared advocate of, quote, equal opportunity, fair process, and righteous result, unquote. He declared himself also to be a feminist president. Those are the things he pledged. And when you read about or talk to young people in Korea today, male, female, they are livid. They feel personally betrayed by these promises of a better, more transparent, fairer Korea, because they have witnessed, since 2021 in particular, numerous corruption scandals involving top-level government officials, especially among the Democratic Party leadership, as well as highly publicized cases of sexual assault and harassment by President Moon's close associates, some of whom had deemed themselves to be human rights activists, lawyers, as well as feminists. So young people have felt betrayed, and they've turned on the Democratic Party, and they have helped bring in the conservatives back to power in the metropolitan mayor elections in Seoul and Busan last year. A massive rejection of the Democratic Party and of President Moon. And I would say the Democratic Party's current political crisis through which they are entering this election in a few weeks stems from these activities, inactions, abuses by Democratic Party officials from 1920-21 on, and the young people have been mobilizing very actively. What's interesting is, of course, that the two major candidates, Mr. Yoon and Mr. Lee, the conservative and the, quote, liberal, they are both pandering to the youth vote. They're trying to pander to women, but not succeeding. And for example, both of them have taken anti-feminist criticism into their campaign based on numerous polls in South Korea that show that young men in their 20s, an overwhelming 80%, declare themselves to be anti-feminist and severely discriminated against as men, gender discrimination against men. So there is a lot of anger against women. And the two candidates, the two leading candidates, are riding on that male discontent. Mr. Lee of the Democratic Party also has referred to young people as the, quote, most vulnerable group in society, end quote, which in our ears might sound a little bit ridiculous, since we normally think of the elderly or children as the most vulnerable people. And there are also some populist policy ideas, such as a universal basic income that Mr. Lee advocates, that would benefit particularly young people. The divisions among the generations, they're very intense. Young people are calling the current middle-age group that fought for democratization in Korea, they're calling them monsters. Because once they gained power, the young people look at these 50-somethings as being just as power hungry and patronizing and authoritarian as the anti-democrats of the preceding decades. So there's generational divide. There's a lot of enmity, hostility between young men and women. Women in the Me Too movement have become very, very strong. Significant numbers of young women claiming that they are feminists by choice. And I would say if youth are the main swing vote in the election coming up, young women are probably the swingiest of the swing vote because they don't see any candidate as representing them or appealing to their needs and interests. So I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to elaborate further on any of these issues. Thank you.
Kathy, just a quick follow-up question. The gender equity issue, you have described a variety of angles related to this issue. To what degree is this going to continue after the election? Or to what degree will the overall issue of gender equity subside?
Well, this is an age-old question for South Korea and for many countries, including ours, the United States. The issue will continue, no doubt, and it's important to recognize that the gender aspect of the elections, the gender issue in Korean politics is not new. It's not something that has come up during President Moon's administration. It's been an issue for a long time. And women have been fighting in South Korea from the 1950s, 60s, 70s on in particular, and especially from the era of democratization in the 80s onward for more equal rights, for anti-discrimination, as well as certain legal protections. What's interesting, though, is that some of the institutions that advocate for women's equality and advancement, such as the government Ministry of Gender Equality. It's used in Korean, it's really Gender Ministry for Women and Family. The current conservative candidate, Mr. Yoon, his party advocates the abolishment of this ministry. Mr. Lee, the Democratic Party candidate, the Democratic Party advocates for a reform. So they are both critical of this institution as being responsible for institutionally injecting discrimination against men into Korean life, which is absolutely unfounded in reality. Women are still at the bottom of the economic and social hierarchy in so many ways in South Korea as in other countries. So these issues will continue. I think what makes the issue of women and gender and feminism a political issue in this campaign is that President Moon really touted his feminist credentials and feminist aspirations. And many of the young men, especially in their 20s, they have completely turned against him for favoring women and creating gender discrimination against men. They blame President Moon and the Democratic Party for their inability to get jobs, get access to certain kinds of educational opportunities, promotions, etc. And again, the candidates are picking up on these discontents and trying to formulate campaign promises around them to curry favor with young men, especially in their 20s.
Thanks, Kathy. Scott, as you know, there is continual reference in public policy discussions to the U.S.-South Korea alliance. Explain to our audience, what is the alliance? What really is it composed of? And we're all aware that under President Trump, the alliance came under significant strain. In the event that President Trump might return to office, or in the event the United States elects another isolationist type of president, what impact will that have on the alliance long term? Can it survive long term with ongoing isolationist tendencies out of the White House?
Well, that is a very important question. Before I address that, I just want to add one piece of empirical data with regards to the gender divide among the 20s generation in South Korea, really to reinforce Kathy's point. Gallup Korea did a poll at the end of January, polling party preference among all Koreans, but within the 20s, it showed that males preferred the opposition party 46-19. Females preferred the ruling party 30-11. But what was most notable was that 42% of Korean women in their 20s expressed no preference. So I think that the issue of alienation is going to be a major factor in terms of whether or not they come out. with regard to the future of the alliance, I would actually argue that there are two potential sets of risks to the alliance framework. One is related to the issue of sustainability of public support in the United States. At present, one would not think that that is necessarily a big issue, especially with the Biden administration focusing on reinforcing alliance cooperation. But as you mentioned, if the US government returns to an America First type policy in which we focus on our own interests over alliance equities, that is a risk. And I would say that likewise on the South Korean side, because of deepening polarization in South Korea, there are also risks among, in the event that a certain segment within South Korea claims control and leadership over policy toward North Korea that privileges North Korea policies over the alliance policies, then that could also be a risk factor for the alliance. But we have to understand that this is an alliance relationship that is deeply institutionalized. And so there's a lot of connections, interstices between the US and South Korea that are sustaining it. It really means that the major risks end up coming from the top on both sides. And so that's the reason why Trump was kind of a unique risk to the alliance, and why if a South Korean progressive candidate were to focus on North Korea at the expense of US-South Korea alliance cohesion, that would also be a risk to the alliance.
Kathy, do you have a quick comment?
Yes, I just wanted to add to Scott's fine description about US-Korea relations, the issue of China, that the two candidates, Mr. Yoon, the conservative, and Mr. Lee, the liberal, they do seem to hold different ideas about what South Korea's role should be vis-a-vis China and the US. Simply, Mr. Yoon, the conservative, seems to desire, if elected, to side more with the United States and take a harder line toward China. That includes military cooperation with the United States that would really ruffle China's feathers. And Mr. Lee wants to hold South Korea more equidistantly between the US and China. The kind of policy that that President Moon has been pursuing. And that's twofold. One, because of a desire not to antagonize China for practical reasons, China being South Korea's #1 import-export partner, but also wanting to hedge, South Korea wanting to hedge their bets in case the US turns more isolationist and Trumpist, like in the past, where Mr. Trump's administration created a big fear among US allies of abandonment and neglect. The South Koreans don't want to be in that position. But I would say that, Scott, I'm sure you would agree, both of these leading candidates, they are known to be absolute novices in the foreign policy arena. Neither of them have held elected office. Neither of them have any national experience at all in Korean politics, and no international experience and stature. So I think whoever wins, foreign policy might be, they have to learn really fast and do their homework.
Thanks, Kathy. Jean Lee, you have spent considerable time in North Korea as a journalist. You were able to travel throughout the country. You were able to meet with North Koreans. Well, let's discuss for a moment the North Koreans' take on the election in the South. On one of my trips to the DPRK, it occurred shortly after the election of Lee Myung-bak. And the North Koreans were just beside themselves. This hardliner had taken over in terms of coming into office. And they were quite discouraged by that prospect. Fast forward to the presidency of Moon Jae-in, someone who has endorsed engagement. He's reached out on numerous times to the North, often rebuffed. Explain to us, based upon your experience, or the variations in the approaches or positions of North Korean leadership regarding who's in charge in the South. And feel free also to comment briefly on why you believe North Korea is not engaging, has not been engaging with Moon Jae-in. Jane?
So Keith, that's fascinating. I love when you share your own experiences of being in North Korea. I think there's certainly a difference between what the average North Korean thinks and feels about South Korea, and then of course what the regime thinks and feels about the election and what they project. I mean, I would love to get back to how North Koreans really see South Koreans, because I find it fascinating. I also love watching their movies and TV dramas, because you get to see in their own media how the propaganda aims to portray that relationship. A whole other discussion point. But as for how I think North Korea is looking at this election, there's no question that Kim Jong-un would prefer to have a pliable, pro-engagement president in the Blue House, which President Moon certainly has been. But Pyongyang is also very accustomed to Blue House policy shifting dramatically from one president to the next. They're also very familiar with that happening in Washington as well between administrations. And so this is not something that's new for them. And as for what Kim Jong-un is thinking, I suspect that this year he's got his own timeline, his own strategy. People keep asking, why are they testing right now? And I always have to point out, well, this is a big year in North Korea. He's got his own agenda. His own agenda is both to secure his legitimacy at home with new weapons, but also to plan ahead to boost his arsenal in preparation for future nuclear negotiations, so that even if the South Koreans elect a conservative to the Blue House, Kim Jong-un will use that development to his advantage. And by that, I mean, it'll be an opportunity for him to use the tension and the change in a stance of toward North Korea to continue testing, for example. And I do think it's also another interesting way to look at it is that if we do have a conservative, if Mr. Yoon is elected to the Blue House, his policy may be more aligned with the Biden administration approach of remaining firm with North Korea and utilizing sanctions as a diplomatic tool. And so that's something to think about as well. Now, as your question about comparing how Kim Jong-un engages with South Korea compared to his father, well, I would say that he has a much more sophisticated strategy. I'll give you one example. Both Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un saw South Korea's hosting of the Olympics as a chance to force their way onto the international stage as well. So of course we had the Seoul Olympics in 1988, big coming out moment for South Korea. Kim Jong-il's tactic that time was to use overt terrorism. He ordered the downing of a Korean air flight. I mean, it's just hard to believe that would even happen, and not that long ago. That was to create anxiety in the region and really to force South Korea to deal with North Korea and to really rain on their parade. Now, Kim Jong-un, I would say, did something similar, but very different approach. He raised tensions with those long-range ballistic missile and nuclear tests in 2017. If you remember that fire and fury, we tend to think of it in terms of President Trump's first year in office. I also look at it like the timeline of these tests happening just a couple months before the Pyeongchang Olympics. And that testing did force both South Korea and the United States to deal with North Korea, but diplomatically. And so, of course, in the wake of that, we saw both the Korean leaders use it as an opportunity for engagement. So very different ways of approaching a relationship with South Korea, but similar in terms of the objective.
All right, thank you. One of the questions that we've received from the audience is as follows, and I'll direct this to Scott. As corporations are melded more into political dialogue around national security issues in the United States due to the high-tech supply chain strains and strategic competition with China, does the election in Seoul have significant implications for Korean and American multinational businesses? Scott?
Yeah, I think that it does, although slightly different. There are several issues that come to mind. One is that actually the Biden administration's focus on supply chain resiliency has created an opportunity and a set of costs for Koreans as they look at their view of the international business environment. Because what is happening is the US is securitizing technology and therefore challenging the traditional South Korean view of China as an economic opportunity and the US as an opportunity in terms of a reliance on the US for security. And so this is forcing Chaebol to have to think on their feet. So that's one issue. With regard to the election, I think it's pretty clear that the opposition candidate has cast himself as more pro-market and more anti-regulation, whereas the ruling party candidate Lee is looking more at government solutions. However, he did something very important in one of the debates. Jae-myung said very clearly that he's not anti-Chaebol, anti-large Korean company, he's anti-Chaebol system. And so I thought that was a very interesting distinction that he tried to draw. And also both candidates are very concerned, I think, from a political perspective, with trying to find ways to create opportunities for small and medium enterprise. It's really a question of how does that come? Is it going to come in the form of additional government regulatory actions that are designed to help support small and medium enterprise, or is it going to come from trying to loosen existing regulations in order to free up small and medium enterprise to take better advantage of the market?
All right, thank you. As we will all recall, during the Trump administration and into the Biden administration, there was and is the ongoing effort to have South Korea aligned with the United States in terms of policy or approaches to North Korea. This is a reality which has frustrated the North Koreans, who very much would like to sort of spin off the South in some certain issue areas. Sanctions is one of those. But from the viewpoint in Washington, the White House, State Department, it's terribly important to be on the same page with the Republic of Korea when it comes to North Korea. So I present to any of you who'd like to respond, if you're working with Kirk Campbell today in the National Security Council, and you're looking at the election, the upcoming election, what are your hopes? What are your fears? What are your concerns regarding the leading candidates, if any? Or are you simply going to sit and wait, hope for the best, and hope that whomever is elected will fall in line with the US policy approach to South Korea and to North Korea? Kathy, would you like to work on that?
Sure, I'll start with these thoughts. I think if we were to draw a stark contrast between Yoon, the conservative, and Lee, the liberal candidate, Yoon has come out saying that he would be much more hardline, much toward North Korea in particular, less willing to appease the North, and also be more willing to engage in a preemptive military strike against the North's missile capacities if they seemed threatening enough to the South, something that the Democratic Party in South Korea would never profess. And Yoon has also made it clear that he would reinstate, if he is able to, with the United States, the joint U.S. military exercises that were canceled unilaterally by Mr. Trump to try to accommodate Kim Jong-un when the summit diplomacy was going on during Trump's time. So on those matters, also regarding China, more hard line and more in line with the US's interests. And Yoon has also come out saying that he would want South Korea to join the up to now 4-member security arrangement called the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Group, consisting of Japan, India, Australia, and the United States. And these are countries that not only have strategic interests in common, but also are democracies and want to promote democratic values around the world. So Yoon has come out saying all those things. Lee has not advocated these kinds of positions. I think Lee would be a little bit more difficult for the US policymakers to figure out, partly because he's right now stuck in the shadows of President Moon Jae-in and the policies, foreign policy orientations, and the inter-Korean relations that have been in place for 5 years. So I think he would have to figure out how he would maneuver a little bit more independent of a streak if he wanted to change the direction of the party's foreign policy and inter-Korean agenda. On the other hand, Mr. Yoon has made many blunders, the conservative candidate. He has been criticized for not knowing what he's talking about, especially on foreign policy in the Korean public. So I would say if I were working with Mr. Kirk Campbell, I would say caution, 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 yellow light, blinking red light, all the way, at least for the next year or so.
All right, Scott, I'd like your response. And then after you have provided some comments, I'm going to turn to Jean to ask, based upon her observations of the campaign, what role has misinformation or disinformation, to what degree have those two areas been important or significant or made a difference in the campaign? Scott, first to you.
Yeah, well, I think that one of the peculiar developments over the course of the past decade that might seem a little bit surprising is that American Democratic presidents have aligned fairly well with South Korean conservatives in office. And we saw that in the Obama and Lee Myung-bak administrations, where they're kind of on the same wavelength. They announced a joint vision for the alliance. And I think that it's very clear that opposition party candidate Yoon has explicitly aligned himself with many US objectives. But I would also agree that there's a little bit of a be careful what you wish for element in that, because there may be potential challenges or unintended consequences that could develop as a result of the more explicit alignment of the US and South Korea in particular on China. And they've already been referenced. Part of that is going to be, how does North Korea respond to the idea of a more deterrence-focused, less open to dialogue configuration or posture? And then there's also the issue of within South Korea, even if that's the going in posture, an opposition party candidate Yoon would have to manage and navigate the fact that every South Korean president still would be open to a dialogue with the North Korean leader. That's a major political win, even if it's based on distrust. And the risks and unintended consequences of being perceived on the Chinese side as completely moving into the US camp. And so it's complicated. And I would say that although it's very clear that opposition party candidate Yoon and the Biden administration are more closely aligned in their going-in approaches, it's not necessarily clear to me that that initial alignment will be problem-free.
All right. And before I turn to Jean to respond on the other topic I raised, just a reminder to the audience that you can submit questions through the Q&A function. Jean?
So first I was going to answer a question I think I saw in the chat from Carol asking about the voting age. And I believe that it's dropped to 18. It was 19, it's now 18. So when we talk about that swing vote, I think that's relevant, which both Scott and Kathy have discussed. I do want to jump in on the discussion about the US ROK alliance. I do think it's interesting to look back at the summit between President Biden and President Moon, which was that last May, and to look to see how strategically in their statement, they made sure, I believe, that the statement was something that could take the alliance into the next presidency. So really trying to project, really making an effort to project unity. And I think this is something that they recognize is very important in the region, both in terms of dealing with North Korea, but also dealing with China. So it's very interesting to look at that statement and see how they've tried to expand beyond the areas where there might be difference depending on who's in the Blue House in the coming months. So that's very interesting to look at. And then remind me, Keith, you were asking, I've already forgotten what your question was for me.
Well, one of the questions that came in pertain to misinformation, disinformation in the campaign?
Yeah, I mean, instead of misinformation and disinformation, I think we should talk about how ugly this campaign is and what that says about politics in South Korea, and also how it might contribute to the lack of interest that certain demographics have in this political election. I mean, when I was in South Korea, I just thought we were just talking a lot about the election. It's been neck and neck this whole time, but it was getting ugly. All of these revelations and accusations being dug up by both sides, especially with the two main parties, about family members and transgressions or accusations of what their wives had been doing. So, it is worth considering whether this is an uglier campaign than we've seen in the United States, for example. But I do think it contributes to the lack of conviction on the part of some South Koreans in who to vote for. And so, for example, so many of the young South Koreans that I spoke to were ardent, and this is something that I think underlines what both Scott and Kathy have mentioned. They were ardent supporters of President Moon. I would say very disappointed in how his presidency has played out, a feeling that there's been too much emphasis on North Korea policy and not enough emphasis on domestic policy. I mean, and I'm just reflecting what I've heard, not what I feel, and frustration with that. And yet I think among young South Korean women, complete distaste for some of the gender-related issues coming out of the conservative camp. And then I did wonder, how were the conservatives going to appeal to a younger generation? Because that was largely a party of older South Koreans. But then they brought in this young guy, Lee Jun-suk, right, who leader of the party, 36, 37 years old, Harvard educated, and can speak to his generation of young men in South Korea who are frustrated by this gender war or the Me Too movement. And so really can appeal to that younger generation. But I would say that, I'm digressing now, of course, but I would say that we do need to discuss how ugly the campaign is, some of these allegations, whether we should pay attention to them, whether we should look past them, and how that plays into how South Koreans feel about these two candidates who, as Scott says, looks like something that people will have to choose between the lesser of two evils.
All right. We've had a number of questions asking about the candidate's stance on Taiwan. And so I will toss that question out. In addition, Scott, and then Kathy, and then Jean, if you have anything you want to add, how would you describe the present state of relations between South Korea and Japan, and how will those relations be impacted by this election, in your opinion? Scott?
Yeah, I'm not aware of much of a discussion about Taiwan among the candidates, other than to note that opposition candidate Yoon has aligned himself more actively with US policies toward China across the board. Interestingly, Chairman Lee, who was just mentioned, Lee Jong-suk, did, at the time of his nomination, mention Hong Kong and the Hong Kong protests, and that actually induced a rebuke from the Chinese ambassador in Seoul. But Japan is one of the foreign policy issues that is, I think, domestically polarizing in South Korea between progressives and conservatives. The current progressive administration has, it's no secret, had a lot of problems in the relationship with Japan. And a lot of it is because they put a higher priority on addressing historical grievance as a foundation for their policy approach, while talking about a two-track in terms of engaging in forward-looking issues. Candidate Lee has doubled down on that approach, whereas opposition party candidate Yoon has explicitly referenced the historic high point post-war of Japan-South Korea relations, which was an agreement between former President Kim Dae-jung and former Prime Minister Obuchi Keizo from 1998 as a reference point for trying to restore cooperation between Japan and South Korea. But a lot of that difference also is refracted in Japanese politics, where it's very clear that Japan has simply never, Japanese conservative rulers have never been able to deal effectively with progressive leaders in South Korea. And so I find that really fascinating, because in the US Korea context, our relationship has transcended power transitions. I think the Japan-South Korea relationship has been confined and defined by the inability to manage power transitions.
All right, Kathy, any remark?
Sure. I think the South Korean public is beginning to change, especially the younger generation, in its gaze toward Japan. And it's related to the generational tensions in South Korean politics, that some of these very young folks, and very recently, some authors have come out writing about the older generation's problems being setbacks for the current and future generations, and the older generation's ideologies, domestically as well as toward foreign policy, becoming obstacles. And one of those issues is about Japan, that there are young people in Korea who more and more are trying to understand Japan in a little bit more normal way, rather than just looking at the country and its people as abominable former colonizers of the Korean peninsula. So if that kind of trend were to continue, we might be able to see in the next generation, not anytime soon, but maybe in the next generation, some positive developments in more consistent positive developments in Korea-Japan relations. What is interesting as a side note is that the South Korean youth are particularly enraged, discontent with relations with China. The public opinion polls show that South Korean youth in particular have real negative feelings toward China and the Chinese. And so that may be a factor in their warming up to Japan. Again, I say this very cautiously, because South Korea-Japan relations can turn on a dime if there is some incident that highlights the atrocities of the colonial period. But it seems like the South Koreans are reassessing their relationship with both China and Japan, at least on a public opinion level, sentiment level.
Thanks, Kathy. I'd like to get to one final question before we conclude, but Jean, would you like to take a pass on what we've been talking about in terms of Japan, or would you like to make some comments?
I'll just weigh in by saying that the shaping of the narrative around that South Korea-Japan relationship is sometimes defined by the desire in the Blue House to convey a sense of, or build a sense of nationalism. I did see in the start of the Moon administration what felt like a very deliberate move toward bringing up the history of colonization. So for example, I would see lots of, even in some of the shops, lots of paraphernalia that hints back to the colonial period. And I saw it as a way to kind of create a sense of nationalism among South Koreans and to teach young South Koreans about that history. But of course, for me, as somebody who spent a lot of time in North Korea, I also saw that it was something that the Koreans had in common, the North Koreans and the South Koreans. So very interesting strategy. Now, will we have a president in the future who's able to look more broadly past just nationalization and to be thinking of South Korea as a country that's part of the region and is able to play a larger role? And I do think that President Moon does think like that to some degree. But I hope that the next president will be able to do that on a larger scale, because I think that that reflects how young South Koreans see their place in the world. They've grown up in a very different world, engaged with the world in a very different way than their parents and their grandparents, and they feel emboldened. I mean, South Korea is so hot right now in every other way, and they want to step into that role, both not only in terms of pop culture, but also I think politically, economically. And so again, I'm going to refer back to the summit in May of 2021, the Biden-Moon summit. You see the makings of that. And I just hope that the next president steps into that and really reflects the needs and the desires of that younger generation. And I mention this because we don't see the viewpoints of the younger generation. We've all talked about it a lot today. We don't necessarily see it reflected in the coverage. It's hard for us from a distance, but I'm sharing with you from having spent, more than a month recently in South Korea, how it feels among that generation, because we don't see it reflected from sitting here in Washington.
Thank you, Jean. So we are running short on time, so I have a final question, which I'm going to submit to Scott, and then if Kathy or Jean have any really quick comments, I don't want to exclude them, and then any final remarks on the part of any of you before turning it back over to Courtney. So we're going to bring in the National Assembly's role. Scott, if Yoon were to win the election, he'd be confronting a National Assembly that's dominated by the Democratic Party, at least until the next legislative elections in 2024. What areas do you think the National Assembly would be most likely and able to check on the Yoon presidency? Conversely, if Lee were to win, his party would have a large majority for the next 2 years. What do you think he'd try to do with that majority, especially if he doesn't have to worry as much about the pandemic? Scott, you've got 1 minute.
Well, clearly having an opposition in the National Assembly is a constraint, but as is the case in the US, maybe more so in South Korea, executive order can be a powerful way to move forward an agenda to some degree. But I actually think that the bigger issue that we need to focus on is what kind of leader would either of these people be. With opposition party leader Yoon, I think the concern is that as a former prosecutor, his leadership style might be to rely on prosecuting. And with Lee, he's a politician, maybe a little bit too greasy, but at least some deals might get done.
All right. Kathy, any comments regarding the parliament? The parliamentary role, or
no? I'll pass. I think Scott said it well. I'll pass.
Kathy, do you have any concluding remarks?
I have many in my head, but for the sake of time, I'll just say thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Kathy. Jean.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm so glad that so many of you are interested. I know it can sometimes be hard to grasp what's happening in an election in another country, but I hope that we've been able to bring up some of the issues and how this might impact beyond South Korea and into the region, and for us in the United States as well.
Scott, any final remarks?
I think it's been a great discussion.
I would like to thank each of the panelists. I really want to thank the audience as well, and I apologize that we weren't able to work in more questions, but those that were submitted were fantastic, so thank you. Courtney, back to you.
Keith, thank you for doing such a fantastic job moderating. Your knowledge shines through. Kathy, Jean, Scott, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone in the audience, thank you for the fantastic questions. And just a quick note, for those of you who are interested, we have some upcoming events and some general announcements. We have our next event is on the 17th, and it's on central bank digital currency and whether or not the US is losing the race. So you can register, you can scan the QR code. And we are also currently taking applications for our deep dive program on China. So if you're located in New York, this is 6 in-person sessions with dinner with experts, really trying to put China in context. So it's a really fantastic program. We ran it last fall. There's more information online. So please do check it out. We're taking applications until the 25th. So with that, thank you, panelists. Thank you, Keith. Everybody really appreciated the discussion. And I just wanted to say thanks to the Network 2020 staff that helped put this together, Brian and Casey in particular. So thank you. Have a great day, everybody.